out, Gabriela.
Perfect. Awesome. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Gabriela, and I'm a JD PhD student in environmental policy at Duke. And today I'll be sharing with you a piece of a larger paper on the role of international organizations in equitable planned relocation. But since we have a short time, I'm just going to be focusing on the framework of priorities for equitable planned relocation that undergirds that paper. And that paper is currently forthcoming at the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences. And my co-authors, which are listed here, are Sarah Hoagland, Erin Coughlan de Perez, and Katharine Mach. Any feedback you have on the framework and its applications is really appreciated. And of course, I'll be more than happy to take questions you have about it at the end. So a brief outline. First, I'll go into the motivation by talking about the link between climate change and migration and the history of inequity in planned relocation. And then I'll go into the framework of priorities that we establish and close with a brief teaser of a few points of interventions by IOs based on the frameworks, along with future directions for this research. So firstly, just diving into the link between climate change and migration. And hopefully it'll come as no surprise to you, or I'm sure actually that it won't come as a surprise to you, that climate change poses global threats to human security and safety. And we see this in the ways that it affects resources like potable water and fertile land, or renders some territory uninhabitable as a result of sea level rise, or severely impacts infrastructure due to extreme weather events. And what we know is that as people no longer have sufficient access to critical resources, their mobility is impacted. And some populations are forced to migrate, while others persist in unsafe conditions and are unable to leave. Importantly, though, I will just pause here to note that the link between climate change and migration is not one-to-one. And what we see really is that there's a whole host of pre-existing social injustices and political conditions that climate change exacerbates, leading to the outcome variable of migration. So what I like to say is that climate change is the straw that breaks the camel's back, but there are a lot of straws underneath that last one, which are probably the more important ones to study when we're talking about climate change and migration. So what we know is that people are going to be on the move. The number of people is uncertain. We have ranges of migrants from hundreds of millions on the more conservative end to 1.4 billion people by the end of the century. So we know it is going to happen. We know a lot of people are going to be moving, but we don't know how exactly it will occur. And that really provides an opportunity for proactive planning to ensure justice and dignity. And to me, that highlights the important role of policymaking. So to that end, in the policy that we wanted to hone in on, whoops, see, I double clicked on accident when it wasn't loading, 1 second. The policy that we wanted to hone in on in this paper is planned relocation, which the UNFCCC has recognized as a fundamental adaptation to climate change for over 10 years now. And planned relocation is really what it sounds like. It's when people, either on their own volition or with the help of organizations or governments, move to a new location. And the hope is that the place that they end up has less climate risk, and they have the ability to rebuild their lives there, either to the same extent that they were before or better. And planned relocation has been carried out many times across history, both outside of the context of climate change in terms of environmental impacts, as well as currently within that context. But when we look historically at those examples, one of the main issues that comes up is problems of inequity. And in the paper, we have a table of 15 case examples highlighting different kinds of inequities that have happened as a result of planned relocation, mostly due to environmental impacts. So here I just want to touch on a few to kind of highlight them. And the first that I think is maybe the most important to acknowledge is the historic forced relocation of Indigenous peoples in the US specifically. And both because this history has led to what I was referring to as the straws on the camel's back, but really what that shows up as is long legacies of trauma and injustice, which must be taken into account when planning future relocations in order to ensure they don't reproduce the past. And also secondly, and importantly here, is that Indigenous peoples have a disproportionate risk to the negative impacts of climate change. So it is even more so important to center them in the conversation on planned relocation in this context. And moving from a more broad look at inequitable planned relocation, I also want to highlight two specific examples in recent history. And the first took place in Laos, starting in 1997, when the government coerced people to move from areas of upland agriculture where they made their livelihoods to areas supported by lowland paddy rice cultivation. And the inequity here comes into play because promises made by the government to encourage people to move weren't kept. And in the new area, the people were no longer able to grow enough food to survive. And they were now in a place where there were few alternatives for the sustainability of their livelihoods. Another example of inequity took place in the Carteret Islands of Papua New Guinea, when the government assisted in the relocation of 2,700 people as a result of coastal erosion and sea level rise. And in the new site that they moved to, there were also challenges to livelihoods, like we saw in Laos, but the new challenge was disputes over fishing access between the newcomers and those who had already been there. So we're now seeing inequities in terms of planning for receiving communities as well as communities who are migrating. So these are just a few examples, really just to highlight some of the many issues of inequity that can arise in planned relocation and the ways that they can pop up in ways that we may not initially think of when talking about this as a policy. And finally, to hopefully highlight the challenges that this happens or that this exacerbates in implementing a policy like this. So briefly, I just want to touch on some of the literature that influences our work. And there has been literature on planned relocation as a result of the inequitable outcomes. I won't go into every single paper and what they've gone over, but what I hope this framework points out to you is that there have been a lot of papers on perspectives on planned relocation, which includes some aspects of equity, either on specific problems that come up or from specific lenses like human rights, for instance. And there's also been a lot written on applying equity considerations to climate adaptation broadly. And so what we did in this paper was put these literatures in conversation with one another and create a framework of equity as it pertains to planned relocation that builds on what we know about planned relocation and what we know about equity as it relates to adaptation to climate change. So without further ado, the framework we came up with can be honed down into 3 priorities. And what we really tried to do in coming up with 3, because as you can imagine, there are a lot of aspects of equity that could fill up, a whole novel or a whole book. But what we were trying to do in synthesizing is coming up with or synthesizing the aspects of equity that we saw in the literature, and also looking at the process of enacting planned relocation from start to finish in a way that brings focus to the temporal scale in which equity is often left out. And so our first piece of the framework is recognition of affected stakeholders. And recognition is simply the inclusion of often marginalized groups in the decision-making process. Oftentimes when we hear about recognition or it's talked about in the literature, it's played out on a surface level by consulting someone at the end of the process or allowing them to inform some decisions, but decisions who are chosen specifically by those in power. And what we mean by recognition is involvement and power given to affected stakeholders throughout the process. Of course, I have to note that, the word communities is a misnomer because communities are not a monolith. And sometimes the opinions that are voiced may be difficult to incorporate, and in others may be irreconcilable in a single solution. And so rather than reducing participation to fewer voices, what we hope recognition entails is space for a variety of opinions to develop a multiple option plan that allows people to choose what option is best for them in the relocation. The second piece of the framework is the incorporation of sociocultural risk factors. And what this means is social vulnerabilities that are rooted in culturally defined power structures. You can think of it as being elderly, being a person of color, or having livelihoods that are invested in the at-risk location. And what this means in practice isn't that every individual receives an equal share of the outcomes, but it does mean that those who are affected disproportionately by the environmental risk due to these factors or their identity receive an outcome that takes that into account. And this is not to say that planned relocation must right all historic and structural wrongs, but what it does suggest is that without actively taking these conditions into account in the planning and implementation process, they will likely be reinforced and reproduced. And the third and final piece in the framework is the valuation on multiple measures of well-being. And really, this just comes out of opposition to the norm, in which the norm is that evaluations are done in terms of the economic and environmental outcomes, rather than the human well-being outcomes, which can range from access to clean water, to sustainable livelihoods, to having access to political structures, and everything that lies in between. And what this means in practice is that implementers must identify, incorporate, and then later evaluate success on the measures of well-being that are critical to the health and survival of the affected stakeholders. But importantly, as talked about in the previous two, as defined by the communities themselves. So before I close, I just want to turn to a brief teaser of the second part of the paper, which is about how international organizations are both well positioned and have unique features that allow them to implement this framework. And of course, we think it's applicable to policymakers at all levels of government, as well as non-governmental actors. But IO specifically, we argue, have features which include the ability to set agendas and fund projects, to disseminate best practices and establish accountability across organizations and states, and lastly, to facilitate coordination amongst the relevant actors. So in terms of future directions and next steps for this research is creating a guide for policymakers that we're hoping to disseminate through our networks, both NIOs and more broadly policymakers, and also specifically to the UNFCCC task force on displacement, because they're currently in the process of creating frameworks for actors to implement and managing climate migration. So we hope this will be helpful. And also, I mentioned in the beginning that we started creating a repository of planned relocation efforts in the past, and we plan on continuing this review and systematizing it so that we can learn from history as we move forward into an era where planned relocation might really be more of a viable and necessary option. So with that, I'll stop here. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you listening, and I'm more than happy to take any of your comments and questions, and also talk offline if anyone wants to. So thank you.